and welcome to the Orange County Crosstalk Show. I'm Alex Burucci. The Orange County Crosstalk Show is a special program that's coming to you from Anaheim, California. This program focuses on a special event and cultural activities that are happening right here in Orange County. Syria, Iran, and the Middle East. Are we on the cusp of the new Cold War? That is the topic that Dr. Roxana Farmanfarmaian will be exploring at the World Affairs Council of Orange County.
It's also our struggle as the still dominant power in this world to try to understand how we can deal with the Middle East and the struggle going on inside Islam. How did we get here? If you think about it, 30 years ago, when we lost one of the most important allies in the region, the Shah of Iran, to the Islamic Revolution, we didn't have one troop on Middle East soil. We had no naval power inside the Gulf. And we, as the United States, were beloved in the region. We represented the hope of democracy and the practice of freedom. Where are we today? Today, we have to look back and realize that we have instigated 3 major wars in the region. We have a huge naval presence inside the Persian Gulf. We have an enormous base inside Bahrain. We have a massive Air Force base in Qatar. And we have invested guns and butter in vast amounts and yet seem unable to resolve our problems in that region or to further protect U.S. security. Most important, we are no longer loved. We are, even by our friends, looked at with some concern, and by our enemies, of which we have many, we are thought of as a bully, as the supporter of dictators still, and as having practiced torture in the region, and as conducting, as I speak, drug wars. So how did this happen, and where are we approaching this possible Cold War? Was an incipient Cold War really the heritage, the inevitable legacy that we have had to face as a result of our one unipolar moment? Let me provide a bit of context. I like context. It's a little bit like underwear. You don't need a lot of it, but you do have to deal with it first. I would say that a lot of the roots of what we are seeing today as the beginning of a new Cold War, in fact, were planted many years prior to the end of the last Cold War. In fact, for those who remember Iran, I'd like you to take your memories back 30 years and remember Iran, because there were 2 major developments in 1980 that are critical to where we are today. The first was the hostage crisis. It began the 30-year standoff that has occurred between Iran and the United States, and which over time the United States has little by little been able to convince its allies to join. The second thing was the extraordinary success and rhetoric of the Islamic Revolution. This inspired not just Shia, but also the Sunnis to think that there was another way to approach modernity, that Islam had a major role in addressing modern politics. This was a sea change. What worked in Iran, it was thought, as a anti-atheist, anti-imperialist, that's not my words, that's their words, movement could work elsewhere too. And so we move on to Afghanistan and the fight against Soviet occupation. young Sunni jihadists gather from all over the Arab world and pour in to fight for Islam, but also to see a bit of the action in Afghanistan. They're recruited and paid for primarily by Saudi Arabia, but also with some American help. And many come eventually to a series of camps, most of them in Pakistan as their first stop, that will help train them for the fight in Afghanistan, camps that collectively come to be called the base. Translation in Arabic, Al-Qaeda. Run primarily, and especially as time goes on, particularly by Osama bin Laden. When that war is over, these young fighters return to their countries convinced that Islamic Jihad has been victorious. We need to realize that that movement had two extraordinary pieces of luck. One was that the Afghan War spelled the end of the Soviet Union, and they took credit for having brought to its knees one of the great powers in the superpower wars of the standoff before that. The second piece of luck, of course, was what occurred at the time of 9/11, which instead of just putting holes in tall buildings was, because of a quirk of architecture, a vision of melting buildings to the shocking gaze of the watching world. This helped confirm to the Sunni movements that Islam was powerful and technologically adept, and that it would forge its own way in the modern world. And this fell on very eager ears in the region, not necessarily in producing the kind of force that was being argued by the Sunni fighters of Al-Qaeda, but certainly among those who had for too long suffered under colonialism or the dictators that had not brought a lifestyle that had been wanted by those in the Middle East. The U.S. response, of course, to Al-Qaeda was to arrive in the Middle East in its tsunami of war. That tsunami we're finally seeing wind down. We've just had the 10th anniversary of Iraq, and it's certainly been a subject of a lot of looking back, a lot of talk by pundits and leaders and people like me. One of the people that have made some very interesting statements about the invasion of Iraq is General Stanley McChrystal in the most recent, just came out this weekend actually, copy of Foreign Affairs. He was, of course, the joint U.S. Special Forces chief in Iraq and head of all our forces in Afghanistan. And he noted that, quote, after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the breadth of Al-Qaeda and associated movements exploded. What was the U.S. military reaction? McChrystal says, well, we responded in much the same way. We turned ourselves into a network. So with today's investment by the U.S. military beginning to wind down, we nonetheless maintain that network. We remain heavily present in the Persian Gulf, having recently transferred an enormous amount of military arsenals into the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi Arabia. In fact, it has been the largest transfer of military hardware in history. And today there's talk of linking the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with NATO. Clearly a Cold War move. The U.S. has come out of that period in the Middle East quite tarnished. And those that have thought over what occurred in Iraq, many are drawing similar conclusions. We were also not easily able to come out of the Arab Spring in a way that would have built up our reputation there. We had to ignore the democracy activists in Bahrain because we have our largest naval base on that small island. And Bahrain was a Shia uprising, and there is no question that with the heredity that goes with the relationship between the United States and Iran, dating from the time of the hostage crisis, as I mentioned, the U.S. remains very ambivalent about the Shia, quite lukewarm about Maliki in Iraq, and still very much more aligned with the Gulf Sunnis in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, as well as with Jordan and Morocco. And so, in a circuitous route, I am coming to the core of this argument, and that is Syria. This is the killing grounds between the Western-supported Sunni, armed and funded by the Gulf, and the Iranian-supported Shia, aligned with Syria's government, which is turning out to be the most brutal yet in the region. Critically, Syria is the intersection of the two great crescents that now divide and arc across the Middle East. The Shia Crescent, which you all know about, which King Abdullah of Jordan called the Shia Crescent for the first time in 2004, and was an idea picked up by Tony Blair, who rephrased it as the arc of Shia extremism. This, of course, is led by Iran, and now, today, is territorially linked through Iraq onto Syria and to Lebanon in the form of Lebanon's largest and strongest political party, Hezbollah. Because the U.S. and the West are generally very ambivalent about the main members of the Shia Crescent, Russia and China have provided their great power support to that crescent almost by default. The second crescent is the Sunni Crescent, led by Saudi Arabia, and ever since the arrival onto the scene of Al-Qaeda, increasingly containing a virulent component of jihadism. Its leadership still very much enjoys Western support. It runs from Saudi Arabia, it goes through Western Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, on to Libya, Tunisia, and these days, Mali. Both crescents are opaque, volatile, and run by or led by extremist governments. Let's first quickly take the Shia. This is Iran's game. But what kind of leader is Iran these days? An editorial in the Financial Times over the weekend described it as, quote, isolated diplomatically, crippled economically, and boxed in militarily. And unquestionably, from the Western perspective, that is all true. We might add that after watching the U.S. trounce Iraq in 100 days, when Iran itself had been unable to achieve that in 8 years, that Iran is also very uninterested in encountering the United States in a shooting war. Finally, we can also comment that President Ahmadinejad, who has been an absolute nightmare from the perspective of the United States, has in fact been an equal nightmare for Iran. He is brusque, divisive, and poisonous, and it is with enthusiasm that Iranians, certainly at the upper echelons, are looking forward to the elections that are about to be held in June, which will be heavily contested probably within the conservative camp, but will spell the end of Ahmadinejad and no doubt bring in a much more emollient character, and certainly one hopefully and probably more in tune with the leadership so that a more consistent line can emulate from Iran. What is not a part of this upcoming election is going to be the Green Movement, which has been crushed, despite at times various hopes that I read about on the part of the US government in our press. The parts that perhaps are less well described by the Financial Times is that certainly sanctions have had an effect on the Iranian economy. But what we may forget is this is not a small economy. It is a huge economy and has learned to adapt over the course of 30 years of sanctions about how to operate even under these new crippling sanctions. It is still unbelievably rich, and make no mistake. Of the $1 trillion that Iran has gained from the export of its oil since the early 1900s, 60% of that it has gained over the last 8 years under Ahmadinejad's administration. This is a huge amount of income.